Let's bring in CBC's senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong, who's in Toronto. And Peter, Trump has bashed the USMCA, or whatever we want to call it, before. But this was in front of U.S. automakers. How seriously should we take these comments?
I think, the advice I've been given is we would do well to always take what he says seriously. The grains of salt that need to sort of go along with it vary depending on the audience, what he's talking about. But as you say, this is not his first time saying this. This is not his first time making threats like this. It's not his first time saying it to an audience that we know quite vehemently disagrees with him, right? We've heard from auto industry associations, we've heard from auto companies that have heralded not just the fact that we have this trade relationship between Canada, the US, and Mexico, but that, we don't trade with the US in the same way the US trades with, say, Europe or with anybody in Asia or China or whatever it may be. We don't trade stuff. In a lot of cases, we make stuff together. And I think that specifically in the auto sector is what those industries like. And so when you hear him say things like that, there is and there always has been something of a gap between what Trump says about free trade deals and specifically USMCA or CUSMA, or as you say, whatever we want to call it, and what businesses tell him is important about that relationship. And that gap is never more pronounced than when he's saying there's nothing Canada has that we want. Because if you go through the list of people that testified at the U.S. Trade Representatives hearings on CUSMA, it was almost unanimous from American businesses saying, we want to keep this relationship intact. We want to do a quick renewal process and get back to doing business. You've had none other than the ambassador, the American ambassador to Canada, tweeting out, heralding the relationship between, the manufacturers in the United States and producers in Quebec that are offering products at a meeting of chambers of commerce in Quebec this week. We know how important that relationship is to the economy and to the businesses that make up that economy in the United States. And so how seriously should we take it? Seriously, because this guy has been very constant about this. But as I say, grains of sand abound because the business relationship is so important. And they keep telling us they want to see this government renew it.
And all of this is happening as Prime Minister Carney is on his way to China. And so what are the stakes for Canada, especially in light of Trump's views on North American free trade?
Ian, I think this is going to be a fascinating trip. And I think it's going to be fascinating on a bunch of levels because there are going to be things happening in the United States. We might get a Supreme Court ruling on tariffs while Mark Carney is trying to make a deal in China. We have the president saying stuff like, let's get rid of CUSMA altogether at a time when Carney's in not just for meetings in China, but meetings with Xi Jinping, and a sense that there is a deal to be had. The question is that deal palatable? Is there a way in which Mark Carney can lower but not eliminate EV tariffs in exchange for a lowering but maybe not elimination of canola tariffs? Is there, up until a couple of weeks ago, China was buying something like 800,000 barrels of oil a day from Venezuela. That's no longer happening because the Americans are taking control of that. Is there an opportunity for Canada to fill that hole? Is that something that will be palatable with the Americans as we look ahead to this renewal process under the CUSMA USMCA deal? There's a lot of sort of loose strings on the table, and anybody can pick them up and tie them all together and come up with a deal that might on paper make a lot of sense. But what are the impacts of that? How angry is Doug Ford going to be? How angry is the auto industry going to be? How angry are the Americans going to be? And is sort of the remnants of what's left on that table enough to make a deal with China? It is a tricky and delicate balancing act that Mark Carney is heading to China to try to pull off, and it'll be really fascinating to see if he can do it. And don't forget, right after that is going to Qatar, where there are more deals to be had and more interesting investment opportunities. So this is going to be an important, crucial, and really delicate balancing act of a week for Mark Carney.
And as always, you explain it so well, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Provincial premiers will be watching the Prime Minister's trip to China very closely. Ontario Premier Doug Ford speaking today about the need to keep the 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles unless Beijing is willing to invest in Canada.
You can't just dump cheap vehicles here. If you want to open up a plant, and I'm not speaking to for our American friends or for the president, but if they're willing to come here, invest in a plant, just like GM, Stellantis, Ford, Volkswagen, Honda, Toyota, and come here and manufacture and create jobs and create parts here, well, now we're on a whole different page. But if you want to just come here and dump vehicles that will hurt Americans and Canadian jobs, in my opinion, it's unacceptable.
Ford says he'll meet with Prime Minister Mark Carney after Carney returns from Asia. Well, for some context on this, let's bring in Peter Fries, a professor of mechanical and automotive engineering at the University of Windsor. Now, Peter, many of us in Canada aren't familiar with Chinese electric vehicles. What should we know about them?
Well, the Chinese have made a lot of progress over the last decade or so with their quality and, sort of global relevance and competitiveness. I think it's still important to understand about dealing with businesses in China that the line between the public sector and the private sector is pretty fuzzy there, and the companies walk back and forth across that line quite a bit. So it's not quite like dealing with a commercial enterprise in the Western world.
Which brings us to this, and I know it's complicated, not entirely transparent, but in late 2024, Canada brought in a 100% tariff on EVs from China. Why?
Well, that was really, it was done to align us with the U.S. market, which has always been important to Canada's automotive sector. About 85 or 90% of what we make in Canada goes abroad, and almost all of it goes to the United States. And the cars that we buy here, most of them are not made in Canada. Many of them are made in the United States. So because of the CUSMA Free Trade Act, and before it, the Auto Pact, cars could go back and forth across the U.S.-Canadian border without any trade regulations, particularly, and that made it easy to rationalize the auto industry and have everything built where it made the most sense. And of course, because Canada was a very competitive nation for all those years, we did very well in the automotive sector. We have a great workforce, strong energy supply system, good logistics, rule of law, all those things that made Canada a great place to invest and manufacture advanced products.
And here's the problem, of course, and we heard it restated by Trump today. He is not happy with the flow of goods north and south. He is not happy with the shared manufacturing in the auto industry. And so given how aggressive he's been towards the Canadian auto manufacturing industry, do you think this is going to have an impact on Canada's position when it comes to Chinese EVs?
Well, that's hard to say. I think that's really the question of the day for the Prime Minister and the rest of the Canadian Party that's in China right now. We do not want to irritate the Americans and get them to do something even more drastic. Our auto industry and our other industries and our agricultural sector have been badly hurt by all of this tariff war, flying around over the last year. We don't want to make that worse, but at the same time, I think it's important that Canada diversify its markets. I'm not an economist, but I'm an engineer, but I'm pretty good with numbers. And I think it's important that we continue to have an advanced manufacturing economy, and that's going to mean finding new markets abroad.
But how does importing Chinese EVs fit into that?
Well, that's again the question of the day for the Canadian Party in China. What can we bargain with the Chinese to gain access to their markets? And that will undoubtedly require giving something up here. Our agricultural sector is being badly hurt by all of this. If we encourage them to open a plant here and employ Canadians to build those vehicles, then that's a good thing. If Mr. Trump doesn't want our cars, then we'll use our own cars, but let's build them in Canada. That's a good position in my view. There are other things we have that provide leverage in these negotiations, and I think we're all familiar with those things. Energy, natural resources, potash is a key one. You really can't run a modern agricultural system without potash. We have certain skills here that are really not matched elsewhere in the world. Our tool, die, and mold sector down here in southwestern Ontario is about the best in the world. And so we do have some chips, we do have some cards to play, as Mr. Trump likes to say, and I think we should be starting to play them. But we have to do it intelligently so we don't wind up hurting ourselves in a different way.
All right, let's leave it there. We'll continue this conversation on another day. Peter Fry is a professor of mechanical and automotive engineering at the University of Windsor. Thank you.
You're most welcome.